So, what does it really take to turn an educator who's passionate about their students into someone who can actually shape policy? Well, we're about to take a look inside the DKG US Forum's intense 3-day legislative seminar to see exactly how that transformation happens. And it really all boils down to this one question, right? How do you go from being deeply concerned about an issue to being someone who can effectively influence the laws that surround it? This seminar, it's basically a masterclass in answering that question. It's a journey from just having information to taking real action.
All right, so Act 1 was all about the briefing. Before you can advocate for anything, you have to get the lay of the land. This first part was all about arming these educators with the critical information, the data, everything they'd need to make a compelling case once they got to Capitol Hill.
And let me tell you, Day 1 covered a ton of ground. They focused on 3 really big arenas where major legislative battles are happening right now: the fundamental right to vote, the very future of the Department of Education, and of course, the rapidly approaching frontier of AI in our schools.
First up, voting rights. Kristen Kern from the League of Women Voters broke down what the proposed Save America Act could mean. And it's way more than just showing an ID at the polls. We're talking about requiring in-person documented proof of citizenship for every single new registration. Think about the hurdles that creates for so many people, from folks who lost documents in a fire or a flood to people with disabilities. Then the whole conversation shifted to an issue that's, right at the heart of the education world. Mark Lieberman from Education Week laid out proposals that could completely dismantle the Department of Education as we know it, which would totally reshape federal education policy. And if you want to understand the scale of what's being talked about, just look at this number: a 53% staffing cut at the Office for Civil Rights. That's the office that investigates discrimination in schools. And that cut is proposed to happen in just 2 years. I mean, that is a staggering reduction.
And as you can see here, those cuts aren't happening in a vacuum. Federal Student Aid, the agency that manages the entire student loan portfolio, it's facing a 47% cut. The Institute of Education Sciences, which is the data-gathering part of the department, it's proposed for total elimination. And special ed services could see cuts as high as 95%. So these are not small tweaks. These are fundamental, foundational changes.
So the big question is, where would all that work go? Well, this chart here shows the plan. The idea isn't to just eliminate the responsibilities, but to move them around. Civil rights enforcement would go to the Department of Justice, student loans to the Treasury, and career education to the Department of Labor. The key thing to grasp here is how a huge reorganization like this could really impact oversight and just plain efficiency.
The last briefing of the day tackled the future, artificial intelligence. And wow, communications strategist Natalie Dean just framed the whole thing perfectly with this quote. It completely shifts the conversation away from, oh, AI is coming no matter what, to a place of human agency and control.
Dean really laid out 4 major risks that need policy action like yesterday. We're talking about AI making the gap between the haves and have-nots even wider. The fact that our privacy laws are totally outdated for this new tech. The very real danger of biased algorithms making decisions about our kids. And of course, the fear that this technology could devalue the irreplaceable human part of teaching.
But it wasn't all doom and gloom. The session gave them a clear roadmap for solutions. These 5 legislative priorities, they offer a really proactive way to handle AI's rollout. Things like training educators, updating our laws, auditing algorithms for bias, protecting teachers' jobs, and creating smart, structured ways for schools to actually buy and use this new tech. Okay, so with a whole day of information crammed into their heads, it was time for Act 2, the action. This is where the rubber meets the road, right? This is where all that knowledge gets turned into real influence, as the educators got ready to take what they learned directly to lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Before they went into their meetings, they got this piece of crucial advice from R.J. Martin, and it's so important. This isn't about winning some big argument. It's about being effective. The whole goal is to frame what you're proposing in a way that actually connects with the person sitting across from you, and that always starts with understanding where they're coming from.
So how do you actually do that? Well, you do it by asking smart, sharp questions. Instead of just showing up and yelling about how much they disagree, they were armed with questions like these. Questions designed to open up a real dialogue, to understand the motivations behind a policy, and to point out potential problems in a really constructive way. It's a strategy that's all about substance, not just conflict.
The educators didn't go into these meetings empty-handed. They had powerful tools, like this infographic. It just boils down all this complex data into a clear, visual story that's hard to ignore. A headline like 50.3 million students at risk, that hits hard,
and it immediately grounds the conversation in the real-world impact on kids.
They also used more formal tools, like this letter to Representative Carter. It lays out their argument step by step, describing the Department of Education not as some faceless bureaucracy, but as the connective tissue that holds together all the state-level efforts for the 90% of our nation's children who are in public schools. You know, a single day of meetings on the Hill, that's just one battle. Act 3 is all about how you win the war. The final day of the seminar was dedicated to the long game, to the strategies and the sheer persistence it takes to see real legislative change happen, which, more often than not, takes years.
In this timeline for a bill trying to repeal the weapon GPO provisions, it's just a perfect example of that long game. I mean, look at this journey. It gets introduced, it gets support, then it gets blocked, it moves through committee, but ultimately it stalls out before it ever gets a full vote. It just goes to show you that legislative change is almost never a straight line. It's a marathon of starts, stops, and trying again.
So what happens when you stick with it for that long? Well, you build these powerful and sometimes really unexpected coalitions. What started out as an issue mainly for educators grew to include firefighters, police officers, postal workers, federal employees, you name it. That long, hard road is what builds the broad base of support you need to actually win in the end.
So how do you keep that fire lit? The strategies are a mix of old school and new school. You'd build those diverse coalitions, you use modern tracking tools to stay on top of everything, you create new ways to connect, like virtual chapters, so you can include people from everywhere, and you use rapid communication networks to get everybody mobilized quickly when it really counts. So, after 3 really intense days, what does this all add up to? Well, the journey from a seminar to a real-world strategy offers some incredibly powerful takeaways for pretty much anyone who wants to make a difference. This comparison right here, it really gets to the heart of the whole transformation. People showed up facing what seemed like these huge, complex, intimidating problems. They left with a clear, actionable plan. They walked in the door as passionate educators, and they walked out as informed, effective advocates who now have the knowledge, the tools, and the strategies to actually shape policy. I think the big lesson from this whole seminar is that advocacy is a skill, and it's a skill that can be learned. It starts with understanding the issues, it moves to taking strategic action, and it's sustained by good old-fashioned persistence. You've just taken the first step by getting informed, so the only question left is, what's your next step going to be?